But I think that this is the challenge for Democrats now, right? That they are potentially entering a feedback loop where it becomes harder and harder for these groups that have left the party to come back just because they're a lower and lower part of the party.
Stunning new numbers reveal the extent of the Democratic Party's trouble with men. New numbers from the 2024 election offer a lot to dive into. So, we're going to be joined by Patrick Ruffini, who's pollster at Echelon Insights today. Patrick wrote a book called Party of the People. He has a Substack called The Intersection. So, join us for that interview where we dive deep to understand the contours of the problem that everybody kind of knows about now. Democrats are trying to win back Joe Rogan, produce a new Joe Rogan, putting all kinds of money into it. So we're going to go deep into that information with Patrick Ruffini now. Patrick Ruffini, thank you so much for joining us. Patrick has a Substack, patrickruffini.com, author of the book Party of the People, pollster over at Echelon Insights. You can follow him at Patrick Ruffini. Many people do because, Patrick, you have so many interesting insights all of the time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I want to start with this first Substack that you wrote. I want to start first with the Substack that you wrote on June 3rd called The Collapsing Turnout of Democratic Men. And this post isn't just about the collapsing turnout of men. You're analyzing a new set of data that has become available and pollsters like yourself have been chewing over. I just wanted to ask for the sort of normies out there, what is the new information about the 2024 election that we have at our disposal now?
Yeah, so right after the election, we obviously know a lot. We know a lot about which way different counties voted. We know a lot about data down to the precinct level, and we can make a lot of inferences. Like, for instance, the fact that Trump does really well in places with a lot of minority voters, a lot of Hispanic voters, especially, seems to indicate that there was a big swing, and there definitely was a big swing his way among Hispanic voters, which was confirmed among in the exit polls. Now, but about 3, 4, 5 months after the fact, what we do get is a voter file. So, as a polling firm, we sit on top of a national voter file of all 215 million registered voters in the United States. And we were keeping track, of these people right before the election, right, to figure out who's likely to vote, who's not likely to vote. And now we have the actual raw data about who did and didn't vote. So it's really interesting to look at, right, who voted that we didn't expect to vote. And on the flip side, maybe more interesting is who didn't vote, who we expected to vote. And what we find is that, this notion, right, the Democrats have and progressives have that, if only we mobilize our base, we're going to be fine in elections, and we just failed to mobilize our base. We failed to go left enough, was completely wrong because the progressive activists, the people who are active voters, actually turned out on the left, turned out at very, very high rates, actually. A little bit more actually than Republican-based activists. However, the low propensity voters, and men especially, did not turn out on the Democratic side nearly as much as Republicans, and that was partly what was responsible for what we saw in the election. So we see, like, really diving into this data, right, is it kind of confirms a lot of what a lot of people have speculated about since the election on the gender divide, and the fact that you have young men in particular dropping out of the Democratic Party, not just voting for Donald Trump in high numbers, but also not turning out when there was a record, right, of them having supported Democratic candidates in the past.
It strikes me on that point, before we even dive deeper, this is almost unconnected, but it's very interesting given what you just said. Is there a world in which some of this is bad news for the Republican Party, particularly when the midterms come around and you now have a base that is low propensity, and you also have a base where it's, do young men, are these patterns durable? I guess becomes another question too, or is it just around Trump? Does this translate to other Republicans? Do you have thoughts on that based on what you've seen here, Patrick?
Sure. I mean, look, I think there's definitely a challenge in the midterms, right? I think this data really brought home for me how Democrats can win in special elections and can win in these lower turnout elections and still lose when it comes to the presidential election. because you really see really evidence in the data of, their base turning out, right? There's no problem with their base turning out. It's that they're losing kind of people in the middle, people who are, people who are less committed to the party, and less likely to vote at the same time. And that's what we're really very clearly seeing. When you go into a midterm environment, those high propensity based voters are really much more important. They may be enough, right, to swing the election, right? So you don't want to discount that. With that being said, right, I do think that this is, what we're seeing is, I think, part of a longer term trend.
Mm.
We've seen it with Hispanics, we've seen it with Black men. Now we're seeing with younger men overall, where this disillusionment, right, in 2016. Just to give you an example, you had Black men dropping out of the electorate at very high rates. 10, 15% of people who voted in the last presidential elections did not show up, or higher, among these younger Black men. And in 2024, we're now talking about this being a group that, where Trump is surging, right, with these voters, because what first comes is, the first step in the process is often, maybe I'm not going to vote, maybe I'm just disillusioned. And then that's followed up by, well, maybe I should take a look, right, at the other side. Maybe I should start voting for the other side. So I think, there's definitely, I think when we look at presidential races into the future, I think there's definitely a possibility of that. With that being said, Republicans are going to have to really, really hard in the midterms to make sure that that voter turns up, right, in a midterm election when it's really hard to get them to turn up.
And this is more subjective than numbers, but I mean, do the numbers tell us anything about whether some of those voters are voting for, affirmatively for Republicans or against Democrats? Like, how can we understand that?
Look, I think that it starts, this process of realignment, right? It always starts with that there is a break with the incumbent party, right? There's a break with let's say, the party they've always voted for. And that break is not just accidental. It's not just based on momentary events, although voters do swing, but there is a function of voters swinging back and forth based on momentary events and what was going on in the economy. That's definitely true. But when you look at who the voters are who are peeling off, they're disproportionately voters who, were previously Democrats, but who say they are moderate and conservative. They're more ideologically aligned with the Republican Party, but previously had voted for Democrats. Now they're voting for Republicans. So while I do believe, right, that the environment in 2024 was just kind of a perfect storm for Trump to do well, right, and we might not see that exactly the same way in 2028. You are seeing just a lot of those voters. The fact that they came unmoored in that environment, a lot of them probably aren't going to come back just because of their deeper values, right? It's not just, oh, we think the Democrats did a bad job on the economy, but we're still pretty liberal underneath it all. There's certainly some voters like that. I don't want to say that didn't exist. We saw some evidence of that, but the far larger share of voters in these groups that are switching are voters who are, really, frankly, pretty well aligned, with where Republicans and conservatives are.
Mm. So, turning specifically to the question of men, then, this is a big question, but how bad is the situation for Democrats now that we have this information in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have to be careful that they don't enter a feedback loop,
Hmm.
because we saw how they kind of have entered a feedback loop with white college educated voters, or these, highly progressive, woke, white voters in the suburbs, where, these voters, as they become more and more of a force in the Democratic Party, as they become more of the voters who are donating, who are activists, and yes, who are actually voters for the party, that the Democrats have become more beholden to those voters and have left behind, I think, some of the working class African American and Latino voters
Hmm.
that they used to depend on for their majorities. And the same thing we could see happening with gender, right? As the Democratic Party becomes more than 60% female, as it continues, actually, maybe in many respects, actually north of 60% female, That just changes the incentive structure. It changes the balance. If you're running in a primary, for instance, right, your incentive is to really tilt your message more to female voters, to women, than it is to men. And you kind of set men aside, right, in the process. And those are the types of candidates who get nominated. I think what we want to see, right, is, candidates and parties who are not appealing to one side of the gender divide much more than the other side, that they're appealing to both sides. They're appealing to everybody. But I think that this is the challenge for Democrats now, right? That they are potentially entering a feedback loop where it becomes harder and harder for these groups that have left the party to come back just because they're a lower and lower part of the party. And that's less and less who decides who gets nominated. That's less and less who decides sort of they're not in the influencing decision making at the high levels of the party anymore. And so I think that they have to be very careful of that dynamic happening with men.
So, in the days leading up to the 2024 election, the media chatter was about white suburban women. And I'll admit, I participated in that conversation. I went to a swing district, talked, multiple swing districts, talked to some of those women. And Democrats were very confident that this block would be what swung the election their way. And it didn't turn out to be the case. But I'm curious, Patrick, just from the perspective of voting patterns, so partisan voting patterns and voting turnout patterns, what did we actually see happen now that we have more insight into the election itself?
Yeah, so exit polls have been all over the map. The different sources have been all over the map on this. You had an exit poll right after the election showing, I think, Trump winning white suburban women by actually 51-48. And it really matters how you think about this demographic because, if you're thinking about it, white suburban women, that includes a lot of white non-college women who lean for Trump. You also have a lot of white college women who lean away from Trump. Since the election, right, there have been the Catalyst data has shown that women in the suburbs in particular actually may have swung or may have held stronger for Harris than previously thought. So the data has been kind of very mixed. Where the data has not been mixed has been with these black men. It's been with Hispanics. It's been with the realignment, let's say voters who swung big for Trump, no matter what data source you look at. And I think that in particular, right, people kind of misdefine swing voters. I mean, they look at a group like white suburban women, look at say it's 51-48, it's very close. That's the swing vote. That's the swing vote you need to go after. Well, that's not actually accurate, right? Because in the sense of if they're not swinging, if they're just staying at 51-48, right, there's not much use actually in emphasizing them so much that you really want to be focused on are the groups that are moving very quickly, which are these black men, which are minority voters of both male and female. So I think in particular, all right, there's been obviously a lot of focus on this community, but when you actually look under the hood, who's swinging, who's moving, who's changing the political landscape and the political geography of the country, it's somewhere else.
The county map that you included on your Substack is really interesting, and I wanted to ask about which regions you think, now that, again, the dust is kind of settling on this, proved to be the most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I do think it really sticks out when you look at Florida, right? That you really see that Democrats just giving up, right? There, it's not just a matter of, yeah, you have massive amounts of vote switching as you have vote switching towards Republicans or Republicans moving into the state. You have the minority party now just not really turning out at abysmal rates. And that is sort of I bring that up as sort of a parallel to, what we saw happen with young men, that if you're really feeling, hey, this party is not for me anymore, I'm not represented that well by the party, why should I turn out? And it really, you really see that in states like Florida. You've got places throughout the country, right, where you still have more registered Democrats than you do actual Democrats or Harris voters, places like Kentucky, West Virginia, where Republicans just tend to do really well because the Democrats, they're older, they're registered Democrats, but they're disillusioned with the direction of the party, and so they don't turn out as much,
Hmm.
which goes hand in hand with these trends that we're seeing in a lot of these places. But I think it is absolutely validates a lot of the narratives that we found after the election.
Hey everyone, I'm about to ask Patrick some super interesting questions about why he was able to see this coming. I'm going to ask him about how the polls performed, the expectations versus reality of the polling in 2024. One of the biggest questions, I think, in American politics, especially as new numbers come out. And I'm going to ask him about Karine Jean-Pierre. If you want to see that, you have to become a premium subscriber over at undercurrents.tv. You get full versions of these interviews, a weekly newsletter, an email address to communicate with us directly. So join us over at undercurrents.tv for the rest of the conversation.